Let's begin tonight with Andrea Hailey. She's the CEO of Vote.org, a nonprofit, nonpartisan voter registration group. Ms. Hailey, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Let's start with these two bills. How do you see their future in Congress right now? To me, it looks rather bleak, but how do you see it?
Well, you have to hold out hope. It is rather bleak, I'll be completely honest, but there's a path, and the path is through Senator Manchin and Sinema. So I really hope that the senators think long and hard about doing their job, and about the fact that the majority of Americans, Republican, Democrat, and Independent, all want a protection around voting rights.
How do you see the state of voting rights across the country right now? We've heard a lot about different bills that are passed in different state legislatures. If you ask the Republican supporters of these bills, they'll tell you that it's to shore up the election system and that concerns about voter disenfranchisement are overblown. But how do you see it?
Now, on the heels of historic turnout in our nation's history that we just saw in 2020, we had bills that crisscrossed the nation just a few weeks later that sought to limit the number of people who participate in our elections. We're the United States of America. We know how to build systems that include the highest number of people possible. We know how to make it safe and easy to have free and fair elections in this country. We're just currently lacking the political will to do so. These laws were intended directly to decrease participation in elections, and they target minority communities, young people, people with disabilities, and the intention there is to separate people from their voice and their local community and from their vote.
You just jumped into the question I was just about to ask you, which was about communities that are particularly hard hit by this. Expand on that if you would. You mentioned people of color, young people, people with various disabilities, differently abled people. Elaborate a little bit more on the impact you're seeing there.
Yes, I mean, we've seen attacks on early voting. We've seen attacks on mail-in voting. We've seen attacks on just making polling locations accessible. In the last election, we saw 7- and 8-hour lines. All of that is preventable. All of that is done by policy choice. And so the legislation that started to crisscross the nation right after, on the heels of historic turnout, was really set to attack the very mechanisms by which people vote, and particularly young people, people of color, people with disabilities. I mean, when you start moving around or closing polling locations, when you make it so that, you know, in Texas, that locations aren't 24 hours anymore, when you take away people's ability to vote by mail, it greatly impacts all Americans, and it's a huge problem. That's why this voting rights legislation is so important. The John Lewis Voting Rights Act, the Freedom to Vote Act would address these issues and help us to stave off what we're seeing happening in the states.
I want to be clear, Vote.org describes itself as a nonpartisan organization, but I do want to ask you about the partisan divide in this country in light of a Gallup poll that recently came out. Gallup asks people, how do you identify? Democrat, Republican, liberal, conservative, moderate, independent, etc. Gallup found that over the course of last year, the party affiliation in the country flipped from a 9-point advantage for Democrats to a 5-point advantage for Republicans. Now, we should be clear, usually Democrats are the majority party in this country. Republicans are usually the minority party in the U.S. But the poll also showed that the plurality strongly is neither party. It's independents. 42% of Americans identified as independents, or 40%, excuse me, in 2021. So it seems like we're pulling farther to the edges on the left and the right, but the middle is growing too. I wonder if that's part of the issue in terms of the conversation, that there's this middle of the country that just isn't really being engaged, to whom the case may not be effectively made in terms of why this needs to be dealt with right now.
I think so. I mean, I think the majority, well, I think people are being engaged. I don't know if everyone is fully aware of the erosion of voting rights and what has happened in our nation. And I don't know if people are awake right now and seeing that the civil rights movement is now the heart of the larger democracy movement in our country. What we're seeing is an attack on the freedom to vote and the freedom to hold free and fair elections period. And so I don't know if everyone realizes that or if it's been messaged accordingly. But I do know that the supermajority of Americans do support voting rights legislation, do want to see free and fair elections, do want the freedom to vote protected. They want to be able to go to polling locations and early voting. They want drop boxes. They want to be able to, access the ballot box. And so I think what we really are starting to see in this country, and the reason why you see both parties with, low favorability in general, is that you have a few people who are elite and often wealthy people or people connected to wealthy donors who are not listening to the will of the American voter. And you see this across several issues, including voting rights, and that chasm is getting bigger and bigger.
Before I have to let you go, we played that clip from Dr. King from Meet the Press in 1965. He was a few days out from having led that Selma to Montgomery march, and it was a few weeks after the first march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge. I think it's easier for the country to look at something like that and go, oh my God, that's what's going on. Yes, we have to do something, as opposed to saying something could happen in November. We need to pass a law to prevent it. It feels like human nature to be more responsive to something that is responsive than preventive. For those folks who may not yet see the urgency of the problem, who may think it's going to be fine, 2020 had huge turnout, all folks need to do is get a voter ID, get up to date on the latest laws, and they can vote, and then if something's wrong, we'll deal with it in 2023, what would you say to them?
I would say they don't know the experience of all of their fellow Americans. I'm the head of Vote.org. I live in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I had to stand in a 7-hour line. I'm not immune from voter suppression either. So people are having different voting experiences in this country, and I really hope that it doesn't come down to something like catastrophic realization before people react. So I do think that you have an excellent point there, and I really hope that we can stave off, having to have experiences like the generation before us on a massive scale. But it looks like that may be where we're heading, and I think in catastrophic realization, people wake up and act. I hope we all act before then.
Andrea Hailey is the CEO of Vote.org. Ms. Hailey, we appreciate you starting us off tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.